forming in your mind or emerging, keep it in mind. We will have more time for questions. But for now, I would like to introduce Ambassador Balakrishna. So very briefly, he was Indian diplomat from 1974 to 2007. He served as ambassador of India to Greece and Cuba, and has worked with UN organizations in Geneva and Vienna, including 3 years as special assistant to the Director General of the UN Industrial Development Organization. In the context of our course, his book, Technology and International Relations, Challenges for the 21st Century, is of particular interest. And also, again, in the context of our course here, a couple more highlights I would like to bring. So he is Fellow in Science Diplomacy at IRS, Research and Information Systems for Developing Countries, since 2018. He's also editor of the journal Science Diplomacy Review and of a fortnightly newsletter called Science Diplomacy News Alerts. If you're not aware of these things, again, well worth checking them out. He also has a personal website, which I will put in the chat in a second, which again, if you're interested in diplomacy, is a treasure trove of resources and insights. I will put all of these links in the chat so you can follow them up. But for now, I would like to hand over to the ambassador for his brief introduction.
Thank you, Katharina. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, loud and
yes.
clear.
Okay. Well, I will thank you for that introduction, and it was a pleasure to hear Dr. Flink with his perspectives on this subject. He's a well-known expert, and it was really nice to hear his, especially on the limits of science diplomacy and idealizing it and looking at it through rose-tinted glasses. I think a dose of realism was required. So let me start by, I've made a presentation because I thought a presentation is the best way to put a lot of material and can be absorbed much quicker than if I speak, read through it. I won't read the presentation, but I'll just put the slides up and I'll talk a bit about it. So let me see, first of all, about the Indian science and technology context. See, before science diplomacy became formally announced, so to speak, we have been doing science, international engagement in science and technology. But we have a few challenges. Our ecosystem is still relatively underdeveloped compared to many of the advanced countries and even middle income countries. For example, the gross GERD figure, which I think you should know what it is still only about 0.7%, although our economy is fairly big. And the spending is largely dominated by the government. The researchers per million figure, which is the standard, another indicator, is still quite low. I think we are somewhere around 260 or so, which is well below what we have. And we have a problem that many of our talented researchers migrate out to better ecosystems. Our research infrastructure and institutions need strengthening, because unless you have that infrastructure and institutions, the people whom you train will not be able to do research. Now, all these figures need sharpening. Exactly what is the R&D expenditure? How much of it is administrative and how much of it goes into actual research work? There are variations among countries. Researchers per million is also something needs to be sharpened. In some countries, they include administrative staff. For example, in Taiwan, they have a very wide definition of researchers per million. So you need, I think, to compare across countries, you need to have much sharper indicators. Let's leave that aside. And what are we doing about it? At the moment, we have adopted a new education policy in 2020, which basically unshackles the higher education sector. It allows our universities to collaborate globally amongst each other. We know that Europeans have got a European educational area. So mobility across higher educational institutions within the country and across the world is very important for us. It brings in new ideas and multiplies our efforts. And we are in the process of adopting a new science, technology, and innovation policy, which was the exercise began in 2021 with wide-based consultations. Hopefully, all this will transform our STI landscape and open up new possibilities for Indian science diplomacy. Now, let me come to the global south. It has its own particular variation of requirements for science diplomacy. We all know the AAAS and Royal Society way of looking at science diplomacy in three facets. There are other ways of looking at science diplomacy by, for example, by areas of action. What we could think of is a more general definition, that is the full integration of science, technology, and innovation into diplomacy and foreign policy. So how this integration is achieved, for what purpose, will have variations as we go from country to country. The RS AAAS framework needs to have expand by adding certain components which are of priority in the global south. For global south, capacity building of the national ecosystem is of greatest importance, as well as accessing new and emerging technologies and using them for our national development. The use of science, technology, innovation for achieving the SDGs. This was not there in the AAAS framework because these were countries which are already well advanced. For them, the idea was to build international large-scale cooperation. But for developing, for global south, the capacity building aspect is very important. Another important aspect is how do you handle the STEM diaspora? Now, now the modern thinking is that the STEM diaspora is not a drain, but an investment, because these are researchers who go across to other countries, they establish themselves, and some of them occupy leading positions. Some of our Indian STEM diaspora are in top positions, both in academic work as well as in multinational companies. So it makes sense to have policies and ways in which to engage the STEM diaspora in a way that benefits the host as well as the home country. Not that we want to get them to come into India, because it would be could be disastrous. You take somebody out who spent a whole lifetime in University of California and bring him here. It would not be an efficient way. And then, of course, the question of participating more effectively in international STI-related discussions like climate change and cybersecurity and all that. There are plenty of these. Now, talking about science and technology, in the days of Madame Curie, individual researchers worked in small labs and by themselves, but now it's become big business, large institutions, large budgets. Governments have now got into the game with large funding and put in place policies. Whatever way science and technology advances and whatever speed it's going even faster and faster, it's like a bubble expanding. The area of the bubble is growing so fast. It has a disruptive effect on societies. The socio-economic impact can increase inequalities. It has global impact. Then economic, and it can displace labor. People may lose jobs in one area, and then more skilled people may have jobs in another area. Economic and military power depends on technology. So therefore, countries are keen to access it and regulate it through IPR is one way, that is a formal way. And then there are informal and informal control regimes. We know about those. And countries are always trying to acquire technology by indigenous efforts or through external collaboration. So policymakers and civil society will continue to face challenges and more challenges in the future. So obviously they have to understand these things well as possible. I mean, the situation in our country is that most of our parliamentarians and political people in the political space don't really understand much about science and technology. So this is a serious handicap. Now let's talk about diplomacy for science and what the Global South sees as added priorities. First priority, to strengthen the national STI ecosystem, access and acquire advanced technologies, engage with advanced countries because they were the ones who have advanced technologies, and use mechanisms like agreements, joint R&D programs, etc., and participate in large multilateral projects. This all countries benefit from this because with a relatively little investment, you can do things which no country can do alone. For example, the Large Hadron Collider, the big ITER, all these things, beyond the reach of individual countries, but collectively. So these are an efficient way of accessing large, frontier science with a limited budget. So I won't go too much into the details. R&D spending is, I would say, unacceptably low. We need to at least quadruple it to a reasonable. Researchers per million, very low. Researchers per million working in India, this figure, because you can have a large number of researchers, but if they are working outside the country, for example, the case of Greece, that's, does not affect, is not effectively used. And then the distribution of R&D expenditure among government, business, higher education industries, and private sector. This is somewhat out of balance in our country. The R&D per researcher is not too bad, but then this is a result of numerator and denominator being small. So it's not something we can celebrate, in fact. And of course, we do have a substantial number of output of articles. And as I mentioned, we have new policies on the horizon, which should hopefully make a big change in this. And this is the R&D expenditure figure and the total R&D spending. So we are like here, China is here, and it's really, if it goes up further, it will probably overtake the US in the future. The US is still number one at this point, but I think in 5 or 6 years' time, China will probably exceed the US. And the South Korea is out here with the highest percentage of GDP spending, and Israel. We are talking on I think Germany has got an ambition of around 3%. They're more or less there. The UNESCO has a benchmark of 2%, but I think somewhere between 2 and 3% is what most countries should look at, because that will give them the means to really make a difference to their own economy. The science, technology, innovation system in India is fairly complicated. We have 3 big players: atomic energy, defense, and space. So the strategic and non-strategic sectors are very important. And then we have a number of other departments, 5 of them, which are the smaller fish, including medical research, which is, I think, and then, of course, we have a related ministries which do have a lot of interaction with science and technology, environment, forests, and climate change. So they do fund some work. So how do you disentangle the budget of these departments and extract how much is actually going on in R&D is still a challenge. But this is just to give you an idea of the whole landscape. We have other actors. We are a federal system, so we have states. Then we have the science academy in the research institutions and business and industry. And coordinating all this activity, especially within the government, is the job of the principal scientific advisor. And indeed, he has a difficult job, because all of them are competing for resources and money and trying to outsell themselves. And many of them work in silos. They don't share information across departments, which is a great pity. And you could have a lot of synergy. So these are some of the things we need to work on, how to coordinate this. And this has a reflection outside the country also. I will come to that later. STI for SDGs is very important for India and the developing countries. We want to achieve the 17 SDGs, and science, technology, innovation is critical. Not only for the developing countries, even the developed countries, because SDGs are something of a consensus between all countries. So we are now participating in a pilot project for developing a roadmap for STI for SDGs with 5 other countries, with Japan, EU, and the World Bank. And this project, if it comes out with good results, would probably be of interest to many other countries. And it is important to share experience among the global South, especially because some of our applications of science and technology are relevant and useful for countries in the South, which face the similar conditions. Now, the TFM mechanism, which was planned by the UN system, has not really proved effective. And the main reason is there's a lack of funding. There's plenty of advice being given to countries on what they should do by the UN, but not enough of money. I mean, I don't blame the UN. They can produce a lot of papers and advice, but when it comes to raising resources, they're still not able to do that. And we see this in many areas. Now we have our own development cooperation program. We call it a development partnership program, and we use that to support training, capacity, and institution building activities with partner countries in the South. And many of these activities involve science, technology, and innovation, especially in the field of training of scientists and researchers. Diplomacy for science and large projects. Well, the picture is good for India. We have got into some of the major projects. We didn't get into the Human Genome Project and the International Space Station, unfortunately. We have launched several international projects like the International Solar Alliance and the one on genetic engineering and biotechnology, and one on disaster resilience. So we'll come to that more. Now, all these large projects require detailed negotiations to finalize agreements, and there diplomats and scientists have to work together. For example, the International Space Station, you have, I think, maybe 20 or 30 agreements which have to be worked out, covering everything which goes on in the space station and who's responsible. And we'll probably have more of these kind of activities. Now, this, as I mentioned, is a way by which you can access frontier science with relatively modest investment, and with costs of basic research going, as the frontier of knowledge goes bigger and bigger, more such projects are going to happen. And it will give an opportunity for India and many countries to participate in these projects. And this is an area of science diplomacy where science diplomats must engage themselves in to seize the opportunities. So let's talk about these two major initiatives. The first one was the genetic engineering and biotechnology with Italy. Became an independent organization in '94. Now there are 70 member countries. It has 3 research centers, and we have about 45 projects going on. And the main objective was to promote access to biotechnology by member states. An interesting question is that when we have the review of the Biological Weapons Convention this year, everybody is worried that germs can be transformed into deadly weapons. So how do you control and regulate? You need a technical agency to look out, just like you have in the chemical weapons. So the ICGEB is one of the intergovernmental technical agencies in the field of biotech and genetic engineering, which has been around. And the interesting idea is that whether this body, this organization can perform the role which may be required in the future Biological Weapons Convention. International Solar Alliance, launched in 2015 with France. The agreement entered into force fairly fast, and within 2 years now the membership is open to all UN members, and we have about 90 members, including major solar powers like US, Germany, and Japan. We're very happy that US, Germany, and Japan have joined it. And the objective is to mobilize support and bring down costs of solar energy technology. The target set is $1 trillion of finance by 2030. And we have support from the World Bank and IFIs. As an even more ambitious idea is a One Sun, One World project. The idea is that there is a sun shining somewhere on the Earth's surface at any time of the day, any time of 24 hours. So if we can link across the world with a grid, then somewhere or the other we'll have solar energy generated, and it can be used in places where the sun is not there. So we're trying to do this, build up this grid across Asia first, then Asia and Africa, and then gradually across the world. Very, very ambitious project. Now, science in diplomacy, it is important to enable better participation in international negotiations and tackling global challenges. And of course, the global South is weak in this area because very often the agenda for these discussions is pioneered by the North, and the global South is largely reacting to this. So the global South needs to be better prepared to discuss these things in an international forum. Now, how do we prepare better? That is, you must have internal multi-stakeholder consultations between the science community, policymakers, civil society, and then eventually between like-minded countries. But your negotiating platform must emerge through multi-stakeholder consultations. We've seen this in climate change because no science department or agency by itself can really decide what's best for the country. Everybody is affected. So they all have to work together and define what is required at the international level. And this makes the negotiating capacity of a delegation very strong if this can be done. And then, of course, between like-minded countries, we have plenty of them in the climate change. We have the island countries, and then we have a whole lot of groups which are not the traditional North and South groups. Then there are some issues of special interest which have not been figured in international discussions, like traditional medicine, traditional knowledge, and how do you develop these on the basis of science-based development. Now, traditional medicine is a very valuable resource. It lacks sufficient science-based development, and it has not attracted the interest of pharmaceutical companies because there's not much of patent benefits you can get out of it. So this is a rich area where you can really do a lot of work, and it has good potential for bringing down the cost of healthcare and actually improving the overall health of populations. So science in diplomacy challenges, I already mentioned. Policymakers must understand the science, underlying science. They don't have to be scientists, but they should know what the science is about. Scientists must communicate their work and policy impact. Now, scientists have a habit of communicating in technical jargon. A good scientist, as Feynman said, can really explain the most advanced concepts in simple language, understandable to a layman. That's the real test of somebody, the scientist. And scientific and foreign policy communities must work together. And I said improving the capacity of delegations is very important, especially if the complex areas of emerging technology. Cybersecurity, is one example. I could give many more. Now, what does India do by way of diplomacy for science? A mechanism is bilateral agreements, which are very simple. They involve cost sharing, sharing of IPRs, joint implementation committee, which actually identifies specific activities and decides who will participate in those projects from each side. And then they monitor the progress of the projects. Both sides put in money, and that's a very modest thing. We are not into a huge amount of money like some of the other international programs. As I mentioned, each of our science departments has been engaging abroad with the resulting lack of coordination. The main one, Department of Science and Technology, has agreements with 83 countries. But I must say, we looked at this, we started checking out how many of these agreements are actually effective. And we were quite shocked to find that only about 40 of these agreements have really done something. The rest have been just signed and forgotten, which we're trying to do something about it. Department of Atomic Energy, 13 countries, and Department of Space, 36 foreign entities, because of course, for the space program, you need satellite stations, monitoring stations across the world. Implementation of these agreements is uneven. It is sort of, I think it needs a lot of follow-up and people who actually work on this. And we have bilateral S&T centers with a few countries, big countries like France, US, Russia, Japan, and Germany. So they are dedicated centers for bilateral cooperation. What is our present network? Very inadequate. We have 4 science counselors located in Washington, as I mentioned. And these are selected through open calls for 3-year assignments. They are sent there. Our network is much smaller compared with other countries. We need to at least have 10 to 15 of science counselors to be. In the rest of the countries, the work is handled from India and by the Indian mission. So we need to enhance the science and technology cooperation work at the country level and better coordination in India. As I mentioned, an operational manual for science counselors is really something which is lacking. We looked at this, we found that most of our science counselors are sent out into the field with not much of training as to what they should be doing. Even worse, what happened was that the people who have finished their assignments have gone back to their basic organization and they've been lost and forgotten. So when we tried to convene a conference of Indian science counselors, we found that even the email IDs of those who had been science counselors abroad and who had valuable experience, nobody had kept track of it. So there's a lot of work to be done by way of uh, training, briefing them before they go, and then of course what they should do in the field. In the field of economic diplomacy, the International Trade Center has developed the guidebooks, Commercial Representation Abroad, which is like a 300-page guidebook. Something like this is needed. And also, of course, how do you manage this network from India, from the headquarters of the sending country? That is another gap which needs to be covered. There are different models of this. I won't go into this. I know if you look at the US, they have a mix of foreign service officers as well as scientists. The thing is to get a scientist out to work as a science counselor. If he's a good scientist, he doesn't like to leave his lab and go and work in some foreign country for 3 years or 4 years. So it's a problem. And then he has to get back. He loses his, the research edge which he's interested in. Putting more science counselors, specialized ones, means more money and resources are required. Then, of course, you can have special assignments for scientists to do work on specific topics. So there's a lot of different models. The UK, US, Switzerland, all of them have different models. Now, science for diplomacy, which is really for the global south and for India, what we do is we try to engage with the countries of the south to strengthen relations and achieve economic and diplomatic gains. I think Dr. Flink mentioned that commercial benefits are part of the game. So, if our labs produce some useful technology, we are interested in exporting it and exporting the products arising from that. Our use of STI capability to strengthen regional cooperation. For example, in our Bay of Bengal region, Southeast Asia, Africa, etc. So we have made offers of the Indian satellite systems for telemedicine, teleeducation, etc. Interestingly, India has got science, technology, and innovation cooperation with both China and Taiwan. And in the past few years, the latter has been gaining prominence. There's a lot more interest in that. Science, technology, and innovation could strengthen cooperation in South Asia in fields such as health, food security, energy, water, pollution control, etc. We all suffer from these problems in our region. So there's a good potential which remains to be exploited despite political challenges in our region. I'm referring to the problems between India and Pakistan, for example. But somehow I think the potential still remains to go ahead in these fields. Now, a couple of areas where India has had a lot of science diplomacy action: nuclear technology. As you all know, that India is a kind of outlier in the NPT regime. We have nuclear weapon status, but we campaign for total nuclear disarmament. We would like to be considered and accepted as a reasonable, as a rational nuclear weapon state. So we basically feel that we should get the same treatment as the other 5 nuclear weapon states. An arbitrary definition of 1964 to decide who was a nuclear weapon state, to us, doesn't seem a sensible idea. Anyway, whether we get it legally or whether we get it informally, that's another issue. Now we have issues with all the 3, CTBT, FMCT, and TPNW, especially where they name specific countries whose ratification is required for entry into force. And we know that we have strategic challenge from 2 countries which have nuclear weapons, Pakistan and China. So we have to manage the relationship with both these countries so that it doesn't go out of control. We have an ambitious civilian nuclear energy program with both indigenous and foreign reactors, both mix. We import the reactors using enriched uranium, and we have indigenous natural uranium fuel reactors. We are developing our own thorium-based fuel cycle because we have a lot of thorium reserves. And we have worked with the IAEA to set up international centers for training and research in nuclear energy. Second important area is climate change and energy. Yes.
Can I come in here and basically say we have about 2 minutes left? So
okay.
Maybe can I ask for final words from your side?
Okay, I will skip this slide and I will come to, yes, this, I leave this with you. These are all issues which are coming up. And I think this is a rich field for our young science diplomats to work on. You can write articles on this. You can do your research on this. This is not the full list. There are still a few more. And there's, as Dr. Flink mentioned, the Ukraine conflict has affected everybody and affected a lot of other things also. So I will stop here, and in any case, I think you are going to make the presentation available. That will solve, be fine with me. So thank you, and we'll have questions.
Thank you so much for this really rich presentation. And as you said, we will be very happy to share this in the classroom. I was going to suggest that, and thank you for allowing us to do so, because there's a lot here that people can follow up in even over the next couple of days, next couple of weeks. We're technically out of time. I would like to ask everyone to stay just a little bit longer if you can. If you can't, of course, you're welcome to leave. But I see at least 2 questions, and I would like to get them into the discussion. So Tivko, I saw your hand first, and then Irfan. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Briefly, I would like to ask the ambassador, the issue of having a diaspora database of not of science diplomats, but of the science staff that you have. Do you have such in India? Because sometimes we can have like great scientists, people who can help us in science diplomacy, but not know where they are, who they are, because they are in the diaspora. It's very hard to track them from my experience. So do you have a diaspora database of some sort? Then you also mentioned the issue of traditional medicines. It was very interesting because I know that the government of India invested about 250 million into a project which was started by the World Health Organization called the Global Center for Traditional Medicine. And it is based, I think, in somewhere in Gujarat, India. How is that project going? Is the international community or international scientists or traditional medical professionals, are they coming to India to do some research there, or it just started and then it went up into thin air?
Thank you. Shall I take the next question?
Yeah, I would say let's take them together and then over to you for reflections.
Yes, I would like to thank you, the ambassador, and his very logical flow of presentation points. My question is that from the global South perspective, as the ambassador has said in his presentation, that our science ecosystem is not very strong, and because of the resources and other issues. So we have 2 options. The global South countries have 2 options. One is that we do science diplomacy in the field of sciences and the R&D side of the sciences. I mean the high-tech research, like as the ambassador mentioned, the sun and the ITER. And the other option is that we do science diplomacy for in the technology sector, like the industries that can start their projects in South and global South countries. And like the India has got a very big project of the smartphone manufacturing and like that. And because I'm asking this question because for diplomacy, we need a win-win situation. And if in the R&D we do diplomacy in the R&D sector, then we can not benefit from the commercial and economic point of view. But if we do diplomacy in the technology sector, then we can benefit from the economic and financial gains. So this is my question, that how the global South should proceed with the science diplomacy with these 2 options. Thank you.
Okay, let me start with the first question. Thank you. This is an important We do diaspora. In our project, we started a pilot program. We put up a Google form and on our website, and we invited Indian STEM diaspora to register. We got about 300 or 400 people from many countries. We got some of our embassies to also pass the word around to, the local community. The thing is, this activity was then taken over by our Council of Scientific and Industrial Research. They said, look, we will do the diaspora and we will do the matchmaking. For each of these scientists, we will locate an institution they can work with. So we said, okay, that's fine. You can do that downstream activities. We will look at the policy side. What are the policies which will encourage diaspora to work? And there we found Iran has a very interesting set of policies. I won't go into that. There are about 5 or 6 modes by which they envisage diaspora to work with Iran. And we're looking at that side. So there is a database. It's not difficult to collect it. Once government designates somebody to do it, all you need is a Google form, and you send out instructions to your embassies to bring your nationals on board of that. And then, of course, matchmake them downstream with what work is going on in the country. So this is no problem. Traditional medicine, the Global Center has been set up by Prime Minister. I think it was just a year ago. It's still starting to function. And I think the government of India is going to put in a lot of money into this because it's just not the traditional medicine, but it's linked with medical tourism. As we know, this sector, we have a large number of traditional medicine institutions in our country. What is needed is to put them all on a proper scientific basis so that the standards are maintained. And they're attracting a lot of foreign visitors who are coming here for things like yoga or naturopathy and so on. So this has become a good, a dynamic business. And we also can export this knowledge. There are many countries where we have yoga practitioners, but then who is certifying them? Do they have proper qualifications? So we are, when it comes to medicines, the moment you use medicines, you have regulatory issues. You have to have approval. But if you're talking about nutritional supplements and health wellness products, I think there's a lot of potential. So traditional medicine, it's the Global Center is just one step. It's a thing we are looking at. We recently had a discussion about how we should mainstream this into the WHO at the forthcoming executive board and the World Health Assembly. There is a WHO strategy for traditional medicine for up to 23. So we are looking at how to encourage WHO to work on this for the period 23 to 2030. Global South, very good question. The whole issue of basic sciences versus applied science. Now, I won't go into this, but whenever Bush had this idea that government should support basic sciences and private sector and industry should go for the applied sciences. That was his model. I think in our countries, you're quite right. We can't afford the large amount of basic money required to do basic sciences on our own, but we can collaborate with other countries or big projects or collaborate with advanced countries in the area of basic science. And you're quite right. We have to work more on the applied science because that has to translate into products which can help our development, improve our economy and our well-being. The Indians set up, basically the government has, right from the early days when India became independent, we set up a network of applied research laboratories funded by the government in things like food technology, ceramics, a lot of these things, which is not rocket science, but technology which can be used. Basic science was left with a few institutions, universities, and with the academic institutions. Atomic Energy Department in Bombay does have basic science, but what they do is they spin off into centers of basic research in nuclear energy or particle physics and so on. So I would say that you need a balance of both activities, because unless you have the basic science knowledge, you will not generate the diffusion into applied research. So you can't neglect that, but you have to find the most economical way of doing it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This was really insightful. I think from my side, an hour very well spent. Thank you everyone for staying a little bit longer. That's also much appreciated. Thank you for your questions. Then let me thank our two guest lecturers for taking the time and for sharing their insights. Dr. Tim Flink, Ambassador Bhaskar Balakrishnan, thank you so much. You will find their email in the classroom in the cantina. So if you have additional questions, if you want to get in touch with them on anything, I think I can speak for them in saying that you are very welcome to do so. So this meeting marks the end of our first substantive week. We're now moving into the next week of discussion, this time focusing on the Sustainable Development Goals. What I would like to remind you is to post your comments in the classroom, comments and questions as soon as possible, because that gives us more time to respond to them and to develop the discussion. I would also, in parting, like to share with you a publication we did with the previous cohort in the Science Diplomacy online course. So you're the second cohort. And in the first course, we brought everyone together in a publication on science diplomacy capacity development. I just shared the link in the chat. So please have a look. As a group, we can also think about doing something similar out of this course. But for now, I'm wishing you a very good Friday, a good weekend, and I will see you in the classroom. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Let me wish you a very happy Diwali from India to all of you. It's our Christmas.
Diwali. All the best to everyone.
Happy Diwali. Bye.
Thank you.